Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 169, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on. In the last issue, John has finally traveled all the way to Los Angeles, and I say finally, but that wasn't really the end destination point when this arc started. For most of this run, John has been trying to find his friend Lucky, who killed himself's wife, and when he found Marjorie, he ended up helping her get away from some white supremacists that she had fallen in with, but then he learned some secrets. We don't really know what that secret is as the reader, but John was so mad he burned Marjorie's house down, and he was pretty much done with Lucky and Marjorie after that. So his main mission now is following up on his mission with Agent Frank Turo, who wanted John to take down some guy named S.W. Manor. We don't really know much about him yet. We know that he's very rich, because he flew a helicopter all the way up to Oregon or Washington to confront the white supremacist group that murdered his gunrunner. And he was pretty intimidating to these white supremacists, so we can imagine that he has a very large amount of power with either the government or just because he's super rich. And we haven't quite figured out what John's plan is, how he's going to approach taking on S.W. Manor. But in the last issue, we saw John working with, and I say that very loosely, Agent Frank Turo in Los Angeles, and John was picking up a prostitute, and it seemed like him and Agent Turo were going to have a three-way with this prostitute. But at the very last minute, Agent Turo decided not to because he was feeling guilty because he's married. And it was kind of a wacky issue, actually. I wasn't sure what the point of this issue was, but at the very end, we got kind of, I think, the main drop of info that was important, and that was from Agent Turo to John. Basically, Turo told John that as far as the FBI or anybody else knows, John is dead. So if anybody was going after John, they would have already given up because they would see that he was dead in all the records. So they're definitely not going to see John coming after them. And that's a pretty big advantage. And that's where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 169, we got the cover. We see John standing in front of a brick wall. There's a bright light shining on him as he smokes a cigarette with his hands in his pockets. And he's kind of squinting because the light is so bright. And in the shadow behind him, on top of his head with his shaggy hair, we see devil horns are in the shadow, but they're not on his head in real life. And we also see that the writer of this issue is Brian Azzarello with art by Giuseppe Camuncoli. And as we turn to the first page, we see John walking through the streets of Los Angeles, and he's lighting a cigarette, and pretty much it's desolate. There's just kind of papers blowing around, not too many people, so I don't know where he's at. But it doesn't look like the good parts of town. And the sun is setting, so there's kind of like a reddish hue to everything. And as he walks and smokes, his narration says, "I'm not from here. I'm from there, the other side of the pond." Aptly named, though by what git I haven't the faintest. The old world. And us good citizens of the old world, we call this place, funny enough, the new world. Why, you ask? Because it didn't have a history till we arrived and established one. Presumptuous, yes, but you'll excuse us on that, seeing how any effects we have on the world, old or new, are sadly in the past. So it's vicariously living for us good citizens now, with the occasional Viagra doled out to our impotent officials from White House chemists. And when you ain't getting a squirt of nothing, sloppy seconds can be quite a rare treat. See, our better days lay in the droopy arse behind us, not the doughy paunch right in front. That's why we nurtured and spread one of our greatest contributions to humanity, so we'd always have a place to be young and hard again. And as John narrates this last line, we see he approaches a glass window, and from the inside of the building where that glass window is, John is smiling as he stares out, and we see a Guinness sign with a four-leaf clover. So I guess their contribution to humanity is a pub. And as John pushes through the doorway, we see the name of this issue is Chasing Demons. Then we turn the page, and we cut to some giant mansion, and I believe we've been here before because we see the right-hand man of SW Manor, standing in front of the doors of this mansion, and his name is Fredo. And a limousine is pulling up, and he is opening the door for a man who steps out and walks up the steps. And this guy's kind of portly and short and balding, and as he takes off his jacket, we see he is also a Catholic priest. And this priest looks over at Fredo and says, "Hello, Fredo." And Fredo says, "Father, come in." And as Fredo takes his jacket, the priest asks, "How are you?" And Fredo answers, "What'd I say last time?" And the priest replies, "You asked me the same question." And Fredo asks, "Time before that?" And the priest just kind of stares at Fredo silently, and they both look kind of annoyed until finally the priest answers, "Same question." Then Fredo begins to escort the priest down some hallways and kind of in the maze of this giant mansion. And Fredo continues asking, "So what's the answer?" And the priest says, "Fine. You're fine, Fredo." And then Fredo asks, "When did I tell you that?" And the priest answers, "April 12th, 1998, the first time we met. You asked me that the last time, too." And then Fredo asks, "I repeat myself, huh?" Then they stop in the middle of this marbled hallway, and there's a door that kind of leads to an outside pool area, and the father says, "You and everyone else, over and over, again." Then we cut to the outside as they walk out that door, and we see SW Manor swimming in a pool. And as he pops up from a dive he just made, he sees the priest and Fredo approaching, and he says, "Father Sean, glad you can make it." And Father Sean waves and says, "Hello, Stanley." And then SW looks at him like, "You should know better." And he says, "Father Sean." And the priest replies, "SW, I forgot." And then SW gets out of the pool, and as he sits on the edge, he says, "Impossible. You call me Stanley because I asked you not to. Not very godly of you at all. Now be a dear and hand me a towel." And he's looking up at the priest with a devilish smile as he says that last line. Then we turn the page and we cut to John, and someone has just sneezed as they pass behind him, and we can see green mucus on John's arm sleeve, kind of close to his shoulder. And as John looks back and sees the mucus on his arm, he yells, "Bloody fucking hell!" And the man who sneezed behind him wipes his nose on his own sleeve, and he says, "Sorry about that, bud. My sinuses, this weather's murdering him." And as he takes a seat next to John at the bar, John says, "Won't be just the weather, you gack on me again like that." And the man replies, "Take it easy." Then John, with a grimace on his face, grabs a napkin from the bar and wipes the snot off his sleeve. And as he does, he says, "Take it easy. I should be taking me medicine after all the nasty viral bits you just blew in my direction." And the man sitting next to him grins and asks, "You need medicine?" And John asks back, "You a doctor?" And then the guy faces John, and his grin is getting bigger as he says, "My mother wanted to be one." And John asks, "And what was she?" And the man answers, "Delusional. Always thinking about tomorrow. Reality was something she never quite got her mind around." And he holds up his glass, and he tips it towards John, and he asks, "Whiskey?" And John's confused, and he says, "Hey?" And the man smiles and kind of shrugs and says, "Your medicine. Whiskey. The doctor's ordering." And John smiles at that, and he says, "Yeah, a drop of whiskey will do." Then the man flags the bartender and says, "Hey, Mike, couple Bushmills." So the bartender pours the whiskey into shots, and he drops one in front of each of them, and then they pick them up, and John says, "Cheers." And the man raises his glass and says, "Good to see you again." And John kind of is taken aback by that, and he thinks for a second, but he doesn't remember this guy. And the guy looks at him knowingly and says, "Don't fucking say you don't know me." And I should describe this guy. He's a white guy in his late 30s, early 40s. He's got short hair, but large sideburns that come down to like half of his face. And they kind of turn into stubble that ends up being a short goatee. And he kind of looks like he's from the 70s because he has a jacket with a dress shirt underneath and they have lapels. So with the sideburns and that whole getup, it looks like he's from the 70s. Then we turn the page and we cut to SW Manor and Father Sean walking around the pool. I think they're walking away from it towards like an open grassy area that has a lot of plant life. So it's kind of like, not a topiary, but some sort of garden. And as they walk, SW saying, "You remember Jason, right? He worked for me? Cute kid? Hothead? Nice ass? Of course you do. Well, he's dead." And as SW said that, Father Sean was taking a drink out of a glass, so he kind of chokes on that for a second, and then he looks up shocked at SW, and SW continues saying, "He died last night. It was an accident. I caused it. And he's dead." And as SW said that last line, he started walking away from the priest who had stopped walking, and the priest asks, "You're responsible?" And SW turns around and points at him and says, "Responsible? Good word. Sometimes I think that's all I am. Responsible for so many things and so many people." And then he looks down pensively and says, "Responsible? I wonder, who's responsible for me?" And Father Sean kind of ignores that question, and it honestly seemed like SW was just asking that rhetorically. So Father Sean asks, How did Jason die?" And SW answers, "Why, the best possible way, with a smile on his face." And as SW says that, he gets a big smile on his face, and then he just stares at the father, and then the father turns his back to him, and SW reaches out and puts a hand on the father's shoulder, and he asks, "Does that bother you?" And Father Sean turns back to look at SW, and SW holds his hands out in front of him apologetically and says, "I'm sorry. I thought you might like to know. I mean, you two had a history of sorts, right?" And then he turns from the priest and begins walking away, and Father Sean is kind of gobsmacked by that, we'll call it a silent accusation, and Father Sean says, "Stanley, if you're implying," but he's cut off by SW, who says, "I'm not implying anything, Sean. It's called gossip, mean-spirited, comes with an agenda. Just little people out to gain an inch or two by cutting down those who seem taller. Party talk and petty vices. The things I hear can't even remotely compare to the things you do." And then he walks back to the priest and stares at him and says, "Word for delicious word. Tell me their sins." Then we cut back to the Irish pub where John is looking kind of wasted at the bar, and some guy who's wearing winter wear for some reason, this is Los Angeles, is shoving a bloody hand in front of John's face, and he asks, "You know what that is?" And John just stares, not saying anything, and the guy says, "Blood." And John asks, "Is it?" And the man answers, "Damn straight. Know whose?" And John doesn't say anything again, he just stares at him, and the man says, "My wife's." And John pauses, not saying anything still, and then he looks down at the bar, and we get a pulled-away shot where we see the bartender is listening to this guy, and so is the man sitting next to John, who bought him the drinks, and John says, "Really? Feeling a bit frisky when Auntie Flo come for her monthly visit, were you?" And the man with the bloody hand is stunned by that question, and John continues saying, "What a surprise." And it seemed like he was going to say more, but the bartender looks closer at the hand of the man, and the man interrupts John saying, "I killed her." And the bartender is looking suspiciously at the man's hand. John finishes what he was going to say, saying, "I mean, you don't look like the marrying type." And the bartender says, "That ain't blood, Wally, you asshole. It's dried ketchup." And then Wally's got a hurt face as he hears this, and he says, "The hell it is. It's her blood. On my hands." And it seems like he's about to cry as he stares at his hands, and the bartender says, "So go wash 'em." And as Wally stares at his open hands, John examines them closer, and he says, "I don't know. Looks like blood to me." And Wally says, 25 years. And I'm not sure if this is a mistake in the comic or not, but the next word balloon has the tail going to John, but I'm not sure if he's the one who's supposed to be saying this or if it's the bartender. But I'm going to read it as John because it is pointing to him as if he says it. So it seems like John must somehow know the past of what this guy's talking about, even though he's never met him, but maybe he got it just from staring at the blood. And he says, "Back in 76, Wally shot his missus in the belly. They were both pretty gassed. Been at it all day when he decided to clean his gun. Wally didn't know it was loaded, too." And I should say the way that this is kind of set up is the man with the bloody hand, Wally, is standing in between John and the man at the bar who bought him the drinks earlier. So it seems like John was telling Wally's history to the guy sitting at the bar next to him. And as John is telling Wally's story, Wally looks like he's in physical pain as he's remembering as John is speaking. And as John finishes, And in response to the ending of Wally shooting his wife while cleaning his loaded gun, John says, "That's an alibi I'll have to remember." And the man at the bar next to him says, "He sure can't forget." And then Wally says, 25 years. Seems like yesterday." And then John looks up at him and asks, "Yesterday?" And Wally answers, "Yesterday." And then John gets a smile on his face and he bursts into song singing, "All my troubles seem so far away," which is, of course, a Beatles song and seems highly inappropriate at this moment because it seems like John is making light of this guy killing his wife on accident. Then we turn the page and we cut back to SW and Father Sean, and they're still in this garden area, and SW is pointing at Father Sean and saying, "Say that again. What you just said. What she said." So Father Sean repeats, "I find him loathsome, Father. All the time, and on every level. That won't change, I swear to you." And then SW turns away from Father Sean and smiles as he strokes his chin and he says, "Loathsome. Now that's a word. Is it a sin?" And Father Sean answers, "I think what she's going through is more complex than that." And then SW turns back around and says, Sure. Of course. So I guess my question really is, did you absolve her?" And Father Sean answers, "I gave her advice." And SW asks, "Did you say, 'The Lord forgives you for all your sins'?" And then there's a moment of silence as they kind of have a stare-off, but Father Sean breaks first and he looks down and he says, "Yes," kind of like he's ashamed. And SW sees this and smiles and says, "But aren't we required to repent to be forgiven?" She said, but Father Sean cuts him off saying, "I know what she said." And SW says, "And you've heard every one of her confessions since she was an innocent little girl. Tell me her first." And the father answers, quoting this woman's first confession as a little girl, saying, "I lied, I cheated, I disobeyed my parents." And SW says, "Ah, the sins of youth. They're sort of pleasant when you take them in context, aren't they?" And the father asks, "What would that context be?" And SW answers, "Life. One that goes on week after week, year after year, collecting disappointment and resentment like snapshots in a photo album." And then he gets a grin on his face and he points to Father Sean and says, "Photo. Short for," and Father Sean answers, "photographic." And then the happy grin on SW's face gets a little bit more sinister and he says, "Yes, like your memory, your remarkable gift." Then we turn the page and we cut to a raucous scene of John, Wally, and the man who bought John drinks with their arms around each other now, and they're kind of pulled in close as they're singing the end of the chorus from the Beatles song Help. And it looks like they're all having a grand old time. And as the song finishes, John smiles at the guy who bought him whiskey earlier, and he says, "Christ, I fucking hate that band." And the whiskey man says, "Well, that don't keep their tunes from swimming around in your skull." And John replies, "Fucking A. What say we drown the miserable lot of them?" And the whiskey man grabs John's pint in front of him that's empty, and he yells to the bartender, "Mike!" And then he holds up the drinks to, show that they're empty. And then John smiles and says, "Why is it, you think? I can't remember what I had for supper, yet I know all the words to a dopey song I ain't heard in ages." And the whiskey man rubs his chin as Mike the bartender gets their drinks, and he says, "Beats the piss out of me, but the brain's only so big, you know. Maybe your memory. It sifts through all the garbage, good and bad, and hangs on to the shit that could help you out down the road." And then he looks at John more straight on and he says, "So that your past really only means something in relation to your future. Memory's a crazy devil, but it keeps us sane." And John just stares back silently as he lights a cigarette and maybe ponders those words. Then we turn the page and we cut back to SW and Father Sean in the garden. And they're walking again, and as they walk, SW says, "The first time we met, when I made you my offer, in exchange for your flock's confessions, what was my reason? Word for word." And as we learned a couple pages back, Father Sean has a photographic memory and he can recall anything. So without even having to think, Father Sean quotes what SW said the first time they met, saying, Don't hate me, Padre, but I get off on misery and guilt. Hearing other people's makes mine that much more exciting. And SW looks at him and says, Ouch. Oh well, the follies of youth. What's your excuse? And Father Sean looks ashamed and says, We've been through this before. And SW says, Have we? I apologize, but my memory's not like yours. Refresh it. And the priest answers sheepishly, because the money you offered could do more good. It was more important than dismissive absolutions to hollow, repetitious confessions. And SW says, like he's not buying it, Right. But then the priest follows it up saying, And one other reason, Stanley, one I've never confessed before. You seemed so troubled, despite how generous life had been to you. It had also been devastatingly cruel. I thought you were reaching out. The offer to establish and maintain an orphanage, well, the parallel was obvious. And SW just kind of stands there silently thinking about what the father just said, but then he says, You broke the sacred trust you share with your parishioners and your God for money. Simple as that. And then he turns his back to the priest and he says, Speaking of which, Fredo has a check for you. See you next week. And as Father Sean turns to leave, SW says, And Father, my reason for seeing you has changed. Now, I enjoy the reaffirmation of the ugly truth your poor catalog of a brain won't let you escape. That I'm sorry is a lie we tell so we can forget our past. Then we turn the page and we cut back to John at the bar, and he's talking to his whiskey friend who we haven't got a name for yet. And John is pointing at him and he's saying, I remember you now, Squire. And the whiskey friend says, Yeah? Well, I ain't seen you before in my life. And John says, Come on. In Dublin, a few years back, you was heavier. Fat, actually. And in Brighton, on a stormy summer night laced with bennies. In San Francisco on a Sunday afternoon, you attempted, unsuccessfully, to explain the rules of American football. In New York, Jesus, the times we've had there. Yeah, we've met before. Countless times. And as John was saying all these places they've supposedly met, his whiskey friend is smiling listfully like he's remembering as well. And the whiskey friend adds to John saying, We've met before countless times. In countless places, just like this. And John adds, We never look the same outside. And his friend asks, But inside? And then John and him both smile, and they grab 2 more pints from Mike, and as they clink their glasses together, John says, Cheers. Now, I'm not sure exactly what they're saying here. I'm not sure if this is just supposed to be kind of like when you're at a bar having fun, you meet random people, and they're all kind of the same person just because they're there that one night, you have a good time, and they're gone. Or if maybe they're kind of alluding to this is just the Lord of the Dance from Garth Ennis's run, but like in a different body. I don't know, because they could have really hinted at that, because the last panel, as John says, cheers, is through the window glass of the pub, so it has a blue hue, and there technically could have been like a reflection of his friend, where you could have put like the overlay of the Lord of the Dance's reflection on it. But maybe Brian Azzarello wanted it to be more mysterious, or he wasn't even trying to make that point at all. Just in general, bars are somewhere where you meet people and have fun. But let me know what you guys think, and you can do that by sending your thoughts to Planes, Trains, and Comic Books, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.